Hi, welcome to my channel, South House Designs. I'm Diane and I am so glad you are here with me today because we are combining two of my favorite mediums, fabric and paint. Just look at these napkins and they are so incredibly easy because we're using ready-made napkins. There's no cutting, no sewing involved, just paint. These were inspired by these napkins that I've had for maybe 2 years. I bought them last fall or the fall before, and I have used them so much. And then I just saw these on the Pier 1 website and it all clicked. It all came together and I said, that's what I need to do. So I'm kind of taking a hybrid approach with these napkins. I wanted the individual brush strokes, that hand-painted look, but yet I wanted them to all be the same size and to be in a symmetrical grid, to be very, very specific, very orderly in their placement and their size, but not in terms of the brush strokes themselves. I really wanted to embrace kind of that watercolor effect, and I think we did it great. And I did this by making a pattern that lays under the napkin so that all you're doing, you have this guide then to show you exactly where to paint each one and the size to make it, but you get to improvise as much as you want with each of the brush strokes. It's truly the perfectly imperfect look that I absolutely adore. By starting with a pattern under the napkins, it makes it so easy. So come along, let's get started. I'll show you how to do it. The grid pattern for my 20 by 20 napkin takes 4 sheets of letter size paper. Print out the 4 pages and tape them together. There's a void in the center, but you can easily place the brush stroke there lined up using the ones around it as your guide. Each page is marked either upper left or right or lower left or right. And here's a couple of hints. If your napkins are smaller than 20 by 20, you may want to reduce the size to 95 or 90% before printing. And you can save your colored ink by printing it off in black and then painting whatever color you want, or maybe a bunch of different colors. First, you want to cover your pattern with plastic so you can reuse it for each napkin. I put mine inside a large dry cleaner's bag. Making sure the plastic was smooth, I taped each of the 4 corners and then flipped it over. Now place the first of your pre-washed napkins on top of the pattern, center it, and smooth it out. Then tape it in place to the plastic. I just used basic Scotch tape, or you could use painter's tape, would be perfect. Just don't use something like duct tape or even masking tape that would be hard to remove for your next napkin. Add wax paper or another piece of plastic on top of your napkin to protect it from any splatters or such. For me, it took 2 rows of wax paper to cover the remainder of my napkin. As you finish each row, you'll just slide it down, exposing the next row. Now it's time for the fun part. Let the painting begin. But this was actually very therapeutic to me. There's something comforting in a repetitive action. It's like crocheting and knitting, I guess, where people say that it is very soothing and therapeutic. This, at least, I'm repeating something, but I get to improvise as I'm doing it, and I really enjoy that piece of it. So as you can see, my palette is quite messy, and I keep it on an extra, that's an old Happy Birthday paper plate. But I keep old paper plates on hand for just this kind of thing, so that my paint doesn't spill over the edge and onto my wax paper, or even worse, onto my napkin itself. I ended up with 3 wells of the mid blue, the one you see me dipping into right there. Then I have a well that has white in it. I have 2 wells that have a little bit darker blue to them, one that has more gray blue to it, and then I even put a well with some navy in it, although I ended up using it very, very seldom. I wouldn't do that again in retrospect, but at the time it seemed like it made sense. While my paints are in the wells, that's when I add my textile medium. Textile medium is the same thing as fabric medium. You'll see it under both of those names. I have linked the one that I used down below in the description, but I'm guessing that pretty much they're going to be all about the same. You combine it with paint in a ratio of 2 to 1, so 2 parts of paint to 1 part of the textile medium. So when I filled my wells with paint, I had to be careful to leave room for the textile medium. And I just eyeballed the 2 to 1 ratio. As the paint was sitting in the well, I looked at how much there was and I added about 50% of that again in medium and just mixed it up in the well with my paintbrush. Now I did discover that lighter blue that I use the most, I was going through quite a bit of it. So I just took the little craft bottle that it came in. So there was 2/3 paint in there. I just filled it the rest of the way with the textile medium, shook it up, stirred it around, and used that one. Now I did mark my lid that that one is pre-mixed so that I wouldn't forget that. And then the other ones, I mixed them as I went along. So now I want to show you in close-up detail how I mixed my paints and how I determine the correct viscosity or thickness or thinness of the paint, depending upon what you want to achieve. Personally, I did not want the paints to spread too much. I wanted them to stay confined, but not have a really sharp line. So really, I'm concentrating here, and every once in a while I dip a little bit of a gray in so that this doesn't become too aqua colored for me. And I keep my paint water right here next to me. It's because I'm all working all in the same color. This water isn't getting muddy. I am picking, these are all the full thickness with the textile medium mixed in. I haven't mixed water into those yet. I thought I would be able to do it that way, but that ended up too hard with these individual wells. So I grab a little bit of paint from this and I mix it in the center. And then I might put a little bit of this darker, more mid-blue in. You can see the difference there. And I might mix it up. And sometimes I mix it up a lot, and sometimes I'll keep the white and I might put a little splash of gray in there and mix it just a little bit so that my brush is kind of a combination. As I drag it down, I want to have some variety to the shading. But what we want to talk about first is the viscosity so that you can experiment and get a feel for how much water you want to add to it. I am feeling what that feels like. How much resistance is it putting on my brush as I wish it around? That tells me how thick it is. Versus all water, there's hardly any resistance. I also can watch what it looks like as it rolls down the side here, but I'm not 100% sure. So until you really get a hang of it, and I still have doing this because I started this as a habit, or I started doing it and then it just became a habit. In my design, I take that first brushful and I do it right down the center. And I do it with a pretty good amount of pressure to force that paint to spread out across the medallion, or the brush stroke in this case. And it hardly spread at all. So that told me that it's not too thin. What I'm also, there is some water over here on the side versus in the middle, so I'm being careful still. I also want to make sure that it's not too thick and it just sits on top. When I push my paintbrush down, I want to see it spread a little bit, because if it just sits on top, it's not really absorbing into the fibers that much, and you're creating kind of a crusty piece of paint on top of the surface as opposed to really coloring the fibers, which is what we're hoping to do here. And that's that one. And I'm leaving that little bit of a dark streak in the center. I like that. I like the variety in my brush strokes. I think they look more interesting. They look like they have some depth. And I'm pushing down and see how much that spread. So this one is a little bit thinner than the last one, but it wasn't too thin. I'm glad that I pushed it down here and not over on this side, or I would have had kind of a really oblong piece that I didn't really want. I mean, sometimes that's okay. a little white in there. There we go. And if that's too dark for you, you can come in over the top and add some lighter color. But I would resist doing that too much, because what happens then is you're building up that paint layer that we don't really want it going too thick on. You don't want to overthink this. This is supposed to be just fun. They're supposed to be irregular. This is the one that we don't actually have a outline for, but you've done enough of them and you've got all these around it to be your guide. So you should be able to just make it up as you go along, because we're not really sticking to that outline anyway. There you go. I want this next one to be a little bit lighter, so I'm going to add some of these in. I need to get some water on my brush. Now I want to, that seems pretty thin. Let me test it here and see if I got too thin. Nope, that looks good. That's a little bit lighter blue here. Put a little bit more in there. And this is shorter, so I'm going to go up and add a more height there. There we go. And that one's done. And this is where you put on your favorite music or turn on a podcast. That's my thing. I have put on my podcasts and just kind of lose myself in the process of that. It's actually really therapeutic to do this repetitive action over and over again and to be creating something, as long as I don't get into overthinking it too much. And so I think that's why this brush stroke pattern is really appealing to me. I can do it quite quickly, or I can take my time and really think about each one of these. Now, when your napkin is done, simply release the tape and lay it aside to dry completely. You could also hang it from a skirt hanger. And with a damp cloth, wipe your plastic, removing any paint that may have seeped through, so that you're good to go for your next one. Wipe it dry, and then place your next napkin over it. Center it up, smooth it out, and tape it in place. And now add your plastic or your wax paper and start back in, just like we did before. Always starting with the top row, and if you're right-handed, starting at the left. If you're left-handed, starting at the right. Now when your paint is dry, it's time to heat set it. And this is super easy, but super, super critical. Do not skip this step. It's nothing fancy. Using the corner of the bed sheet that you cut off, or just a thin piece of cotton fabric, press using the hottest iron setting that your napkin fabric can handle. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes on the front side, flip it over, and then just a quick once over on the back, and you should be good to go. To test their color fastness, I cut a sample in half and washed just one half. Isn't it amazing? They are exactly the same. Nothing was lost in the wash. I also recommend that you wash them after you heat set them, just to soften them up. The paint will be stiff on top. Wash and dry them, and they'll soften right up. I am crazy about these napkins, so of course we need a couple of glamour shots, right? But coming along in a sec is a bonus video sharing some tips and my learning process for making these napkins. You can learn from my mistakes and my aha moments. So here is the old bed sheet that I used to sample my colors and my process along the way. And I started here with acrylic craft paints. and tried to see if I could get the watercolor look that I was going for. Like, I love this edge here. I like this edge here, but I needed to make sure that I didn't thin the paint so much that they spread. And this also showed me that I wanted to go with lighter colors. I thought these looked like the colors I would use, but when I put them on the fabric and they dried, they are darker than what I wanted. So that was a good amount of information to get there. And then I just decided, well, maybe with watercolors, sometimes you get the paper wet before you put the paint on to get it to move the direction you want it to move. So I thought maybe I could do that with fabric too. And so I did that in this corner. I got this corner wet, and then I applied my paint without it being so thin, hoping that it wouldn't spread too far. It looked good and promising for the first 10 or 15 seconds, and so I went over here and started playing, came back 10 minutes later, and it's like, oops, that just looks a little bit too much like tie-dye for me. That just takes me back to some really awkward middle school years, and I really don't need to revisit those times all that often. So I am going to save this idea for another time, but if you like this look, go for it. It works great. And I started experimenting with the watercolors then, because I thought, well, maybe I'm close. Maybe I could replicate this with using watercolor paints. And if I mix textile medium in that and heat set it, would it be washable? And yes, it is. You can use watercolors. I just opted not to because it's difficult to mix the colors regularly in watercolor. And I couldn't come up with the watercolor pre-made in the color I wanted. And I knew that it was going to take a lot of paint and over a couple of days for me to do all these napkins because I didn't have one big block of time. So I knew that I wouldn't come close to putting them all together again. So I thought that's not going to work for me. Plus, if you look, I don't have that much control. It spreads, and there are some lighter and darker spots, but it doesn't really have that same watercolor feel that I wanted. So I eliminated this. I went back to the acrylics, and I'm very happy with what I did. I learned that I shouldn't make it as thick. I needed to go thinner and more water mixed in with it and not build it up so much on top of the fabric. Not to resist the temptation to keep putting another color on top and another color on top and working it. Resist that and just do a couple of quick swipes, and then it's not as crusty and stiff on top. Plus, you're going to wash and dry it after you're all done anyway, and that softens it all up also. So nothing to be afraid about with that. So I hope that this helps you understand. Oh, here's another spot. This is where I was really more testing colors and how much water to put in it. You can see that some really ran right here and here. Those ran more than other ones did. And your colors change in the fabric. So you want to definitely test your colors before you paint your whole napkin. Test it on some scrap and see if that's the color that you really want. And let it dry and see. Okay? I hope this helps you out. Grab a piece of scrap fabric and get to playing with it, and you'll have wonderful napkins before very long. Thanks for joining me today. I sure would appreciate a thumbs up, and subscribe if you aren't already, and please consider sharing this with a friend. Thank you so much. Have a great one.